In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, 1885, mercy was a dangerous luxury. But on a freezing November night, a lonely widow named Martha Sterling made a choice that should have signed her death warrant. She didn't just break the law, she defied the most ruthless men in the territory to protect two shivering strangers. The town waited for the Apache arrows to fly. They waited for the slaughter. But what rode out of the sunrise the next morning wasn't a war party looking for blood. It was a single man, with a message that would haunt the town of Red Rock for 100 years. This is the story history tried to bury. The wind howling through the Dragoon Mountains didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like the crying of lost souls. For Martha Sterling, living 5 miles outside the settlement of Red Rock, silence was usually her only companion. Since her husband, Elias, had died in a mining collapse 3 years prior, Martha had run the homestead alone. She was 40 years old, her hands calloused from the plow, her face etched with the kind of stoicism that only the frontier could carve. It was November 14th, 1885. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent bruised purples and blood reds. Martha was finishing the evening chores, locking the door to the chicken coop, when she heard it. It wasn't the howl of a coyote. It was a snap of dry brush, too heavy for a rabbit, too clumsy for a deer. Martha froze. Her hand instinctively went to the heavy Colt Navy revolver tucked into her apron string. In this part of the territory, visitors after dark were rarely bearing gifts. They were usually drifters, outlaws, or desperate men looking for an easy target. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady. "I'm armed and I don't miss." The only answer was the rustling of the dry corn stalks in the dying light. Martha pulled the hammer back. Click. The sound echoed in the cold air. She took a step toward the barn, the lantern in her left hand, casting long, dancing shadows against the weathered wood. As she rounded the corner of the water trough, she saw them. They weren't bandits, they weren't drifters. Huddled together in the dirt, shivering violently against the biting wind, were 2 young girls. They couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old. They wore tattered buckskins, stained with mud and dried blood. Their black hair was matted, and their eyes, wide, terrified, and dark as obsidian, stared up at the barrel of Martha's gun. They were Apache, Chiricahua, by the look of the beadwork on the older one's torn moccasin. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. In 1885, the tension between the settlers and the Apache was at a breaking point. Geronimo had broken out of the reservation again, and fear had turned the local townsfolk into a paranoid militia. To aid an Apache was considered treason. To harbor one was a death sentence. The older girl moved protectively in front of the younger one, trembling not just from the cold, but from the certainty that they were about to die. Martha looked at the gun in her hand, then at the girls. She looked at the horizon, where the dust of riders might appear at any moment. She knew the law. She knew the danger. If Sheriff Big Jim Coltrane found them here, he wouldn't just arrest them. He would make an example of them. And then he would hang Martha for a traitor. But Martha Sterling was a woman who had buried a husband and 2 children to the fever. She knew the look of a terrified child. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the gun. She uncocked the hammer. "Get up," she whispered, gesturing with her head toward the house. The girls didn't move. Martha sighed, holstered the weapon, and held out the lantern. "Come on, before the wolves smell you." It was the first twist in a night that would change everything. Martha didn't know it yet, but by opening that door, she had just invited a war to her doorstep. The cabin was warm, smelling of sage and wood smoke. Martha had fed the girls a stew of venison and potatoes, which they ate with their hands, ravenously, their eyes never leaving her. They didn't speak a word of English, and Martha spoke no Apache. But fear is a universal language. She examined the older girl's arm. It was grazed by a bullet, a fresh wound. Someone had been hunting them. "You're safe here," Martha murmured, wrapping a clean bandage around the copper skin. The girl flinched but didn't pull away. Just as the younger girl's eyelids began to droop, the sound of galloping horses shattered the peace. Martha doused the lantern instantly. The cabin plunged into darkness. The girls gasped, scrambling into the corner behind the wood stove. "Quiet!" Martha hissed. "Not a sound." She moved to the window, peering through the crack in the heavy drapes. 4 riders. They carried torches that spat sparks into the night. Even in the dark, she recognized the silhouette of the lead rider. It was Sheriff Jim Coltrane, a man who wore a badge but operated like a warlord. He was known for 2 things: his hatred of the hostiles and his desire for Martha's land, which sat on a prime water source. Heavy boots stomped onto the porch. Then a fist pounded the door, shaking the dust from the rafters. "Martha, open up! We know you're awake!" Martha took a deep breath. She grabbed a shawl, threw it over her shoulders to hide the trembling of her hands, and lit a single candle. She opened the door just a crack, leaving the safety chain on. "It's midnight, Jim," Martha said, cold as ice. A decent man would be in his bed. Sheriff Coltrane pushed his face close to the crack. The torchlight illuminated his yellowed teeth and the whiskey sweat on his brow. "We're tracking runaways, Martha. 2 Apache brats slipped a transport wagon near the pass. One's wounded. We tracked their blood to your fence line." "I haven't seen anything," Martha lied, her voice unwavering. "Coyotes have been howling all night. Maybe they got them." Coltrane narrowed his eyes. "You sure about that, widow? Because harboring the enemy, that's a hanging offense, even for a white woman." One of the deputies behind him spat on the ground. "Let's just search the place, Sheriff. She's probably hiding him in the root cellar." Martha's grip on the door tightened. The girls weren't in the cellar. They were 10 feet away, behind the stove. If Coltrane came in, it was over. "You step foot in my house without a warrant, Jim Coltrane, and I'll shoot you where you stand," Martha said. "My husband left me this property, and he left me his Winchester. You want to test me?" It was a bluff. The Winchester was unloaded in the corner. But Coltrane hesitated. He knew Martha was a crack shot with a pistol, and he didn't want to take a bullet over 2 runaway children. He stepped back, a sneer curling his lip. "Fine, have it your way. But we're watching the roads. If those savages are here, they'll starve eventually. And when they come out, we'll be waiting." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Sleep tight, Martha." As the riders thundered away, Martha slid to the floor, her back against the door, gasping for air. She had bought them time, maybe a few hours. But come morning, Coltrane would be back, likely with more men. She looked at the girls. The older one was standing now, holding a small, peculiar amulet made of bone and feathers. She walked over to Martha and placed it in the widow's hand. It wasn't just a trinket. It was a signet, a marker of a high-ranking family. Martha didn't realize it then, but she hadn't just saved 2 random orphans. She had saved the daughters of Talzet, a war chief whose name was whispered with dread across the frontier, a man who was known to burn entire settlements for the loss of a single horse. And he was coming. The night dragged on like a slow death. Martha didn't sleep. She spent the hours packing a rucksack with dried meat, water skins, and bandages. She knew she couldn't keep the girls here. At first light, she would have to load them into the wagon under a tarp and try to smuggle them toward the mission in San Angelo, 50 miles south. It was a suicide mission, but staying put was certain death. The younger girl, whose name Martha learned was Nayland, finally slept. The older one, Lawson, watched the window like a hawk. At 4 a.m., the air grew unnaturally still. The wind died. The crickets stopped chirping. Martha, dozing in the rocking chair with her pistol in her lap, jerked awake. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It was the kind of silence that happens when a predator enters the clearing. Then, a sound. Not a knock. Not a shout. A single, low whistle. It sounded like a mourning dove, but deeper. Lawson's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide, not with fear, but with recognition. She scrambled to the window and made a sharp, clicking sound with her tongue. From outside, the whistle came again. Martha stood up, blowing out the candle. She moved to the window. The moon was full, bathing the ranch in a ghostly silver light. Standing in the middle of her yard, seemingly manifesting out of the thin air, was a rider. He sat on a massive paint horse. He wore no shirt, despite the freezing temperature, his chest painted with black and white stripes of war paint. A repeating rifle rested easily across his saddle. He was flanked by 6 other riders, all silent, all heavily armed. It was Talzet. Martha's blood ran cold. She had heard the stories. Talzet didn't negotiate. He didn't trade. He took. And usually he left nothing behind but ash. Coltrane must have missed them. Or perhaps Talzet's scouts had simply slipped past the sheriff's drunken blockade. The chief raised his hand. The riders behind him knocked arrows to their bows. Martha looked at the girls. Lawson was smiling, tears streaming down her face. "Father," the girl whispered in English, the first word she had spoken all night. Martha realized she had a choice. She could barricade the door and pray, or she could open it. If she opened it, he might kill her for having his daughters. If she didn't, he would burn the house down to get to them. She holstered her gun. She unlocked the door. She stepped out onto the porch, her hands empty and raised, palm out. Talzet turned his gaze upon her. His face was a mask of granite, scarred and terrifying. He looked at the white woman, then at the open door. Lawson and Nayland ran out past Martha, sprinting across the frozen dirt. They didn't stop until they reached the paint horse. Talzet reached down, his demeanor breaking for a fraction of a second as he hoisted the younger girl, Nayland, onto the saddle in front of him. He touched Lawson's face, checking her wound. He said something to Lawson in their tongue, harsh and quick. Lawson pointed at Martha. She pantomimed the food, the bandage, the sheriff's knock, and Martha standing at the door. Talzet looked back at Martha. The tension was thick enough to choke on. The 6 warriors behind him still had their bows drawn, aimed squarely at Martha's chest. Talzet nudged his horse forward. He rode until he was 5 feet from the porch. The horse's hot breath steamed in the cold air. He looked down at Martha. His eyes were black pits, unreadable. "Coltrane comes at dawn," Talzet said. His English was broken, guttural, deep as a canyon echo. Martha blinked, stunned he spoke her language. "I know. He comes to burn," Talzet said. "I know that, too," Martha replied, her voice shaking, but her chin held high. "Take your daughters. Go. I can handle Coltrane." Talzet stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he did something that no one in the territory would have believed. He reached into a leather pouch at his waist. He pulled out a heavy, silver medallion, inlaid with turquoise. A spoil of war, perhaps, or an heirloom. He dropped it into the dirt at Martha's feet. "When the fire comes," he said, "stand in the smoke." With a sharp yip, he spun his horse. The war party vanished into the darkness as quickly as they had arrived, swallowed by the sagebrush. Martha was left standing alone on the porch, the silver medallion gleaming in the moonlight. She didn't understand his words. Stand in the smoke. She picked up the medallion. It was heavy, warm from his hand. She didn't have time to ponder riddles. Talzet was right. Coltrane was coming at dawn, and he wasn't coming to arrest her anymore. He was coming to erase her. But what Martha didn't know was that Talzet hadn't left the valley. He had simply moved to the high ground. The sheriff was about to wake up the devil. The sun rose over the Dragoon Mountains like a bloodshot eye. It didn't bring warmth, it only brought visibility to the kill box. Martha Sterling had not slept. She sat in her kitchen, the heavy oak table turned on its side to block the front window. On the floor beside her sat a box of .44-40 ammunition, a pitcher of water, and the silver medallion Talzet had dropped in the dirt. She had run her thumb over the turquoise inlay so many times in the last 3 hours that the stone seemed to hum with heat. Stand in the smoke. The words tumbled through her mind, a riddle she couldn't solve. Was it a metaphor? A spiritual instruction? Or was it a tactical command from a man who had survived a dozen campaigns against the U.S. cavalry? At 6:15 a.m., the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't the rhythmic trot of 4 horses this time. It was the heavy, thundering rumble of a cavalcade. Martha peered through a knothole in the wall she used for ventilation. Sheriff Jim Coltrane hadn't just brought his deputies. He had deputized the dregs of the Red Rock Saloon. There were at least 15 men. They rode hard, dust kicking up in a suffocating cloud behind them. Among them, Martha recognized faces that made her stomach turn. There was Josiah Shotgun Pete, a man rumored to have killed a prospector over a game of faro in Tombstone. There was Silas Cobb, a cattle rustler who had somehow avoided the noose by doing Coltrane's dirty work. They didn't approach the house with caution. They fanned out in a semicircle, effectively cutting off any escape route to the canyon. They trampled her vegetable garden, their horses crushing the winter squash she had carefully covered with straw. Coltrane rode to the front, his horse dancing nervously. He looked hungover, his eyes puffy, but his rage was focused and sharp. He held a lit torch in one hand and his revolver in the other. "Martha Sterling," his voice boomed, cracking in the dry air, "I'm giving you one chance to walk out of there. Send out the Apache runaways, and we'll talk about letting you keep your land." Martha stood up, grabbed her Winchester 1873, and racked the lever. The mechanical clack-clack was loud enough to be heard outside. "I told you last night, Jim," she shouted through the broken window pane. "There's no one here but me. You're trespassing." Coltrane laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "We found the tracks, Martha. Pony tracks, unshod, heading right for your porch. And they didn't leave. You're harboring hostiles. That makes you an enemy of the territory." He signaled to Silas Cobb. "Burn the barn." "No!" Martha screamed, raising her rifle. She aimed for the torch in Cobb's hand and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and deafening. The bullet didn't hit the torch. It struck the wooden post of the corral fence, inches from Cobb's head, sending splinters flying. Cobb's horse reared, throwing the man into the dirt. The posse erupted. Guns were drawn instantly. "Hold fire!" Coltrane roared, raising a hand. He didn't want a siege. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted the town to see what happened to Indian lovers. "She wants to play hard," Coltrane sneered. "Fine, burn it all, the barn, the coop, and if she doesn't come out, burn the house." 3 men dismounted, lighting torches from Coltrane's. They moved toward the barn first. The wood was old and dry as bone. The moment the fire touched the hayloft, it went up with a sickening whoosh. Thick black smoke began to billow into the sky. It was oily and acrid, carrying the smell of burning tar and dry pine. Martha watched in horror as flames licked up the side of the structure her late husband had built with his own hands. The heat was intense, radiating through the cabin walls. "Come on out, Martha," Coltrane yelled. "It's getting hot in there." The wind shifted. The morning breeze, usually blowing from the north, suddenly swirled. The massive plume of black smoke from the barn flattened out, rolling across the yard, engulfing the space between the burning barn and the house. "Stand in the smoke." Martha froze. She looked at the medallion on the table. She looked at the smoke rolling past her window, thick as a heavy fog. If she stayed in the house, they would burn it next. She would be trapped. But if she went out the back, they would shoot her down. But the smoke... The smoke was moving toward the east, directly across the open yard where the posse was clustered, coughing and waving their hands. It was a screen. A wall of grey darkness. Talzet hadn't predicted the wind. He knew the land. He knew that at sunrise, the thermal draft from the canyon pulled the air and the smoke down toward the creek bed where the sheriff was positioned. Martha grabbed the medallion and shoved it into her pocket. She grabbed her rifle. She didn't go out the back. She opened the front door. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The smoke was blinding. She couldn't see 5 feet in front of her. She stepped off the porch, coughing, her eyes watering. She was completely exposed, yet completely invisible. "I can't see her!" she heard Josiah Pete yell. "Where is she?" "Watch the door!" Coltrane shouted, somewhere to her left. "Shoot anything that moves." Martha walked forward. She didn't run. She walked right into the heart of the black cloud, just as Talzet had commanded. She stood there, the smoke swirling around her skirts, the roar of the fire drowning out the sound of her own heartbeat. She was in the belly of the beast, hidden by the destruction of her own life. She waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. A bullet? An arrow? Then she heard it. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a sound like a canvas sheet ripping in a high wind. Thwip, thwip, thwip. From the smoke ahead of her, a scream pierced the air. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated shock. "My leg! God Almighty, my leg! Where's it coming from?" Coltrane shrieked. "I can't see." Martha stood still, the medallion heavy in her pocket. The smoke was her shield. But for the men on horses, silhouetted against the rising sun and the clear air above the smoke layer, they were targets. Talzet hadn't left. He had just waited for the sheriff to light the signal fire. The panic in the posse was immediate and absolute. The Apache were not fighting a traditional battle. They weren't riding in screaming war cries. They were ghosts. They were positioned on the limestone ridge overlooking the homestead, 300 yards away, a distance considered impossible for a bow and arrow by most white settlers. But the Chiricahua didn't use standard bows for siege. They used longbows made of mulberry wood, backed with sinew, capable of driving an arrow through a buffalo or a man at incredible distances. And they were firing in an arc, raining death down into the smoke. Thwip! A horse screamed and collapsed, an arrow buried deep in its flank. Its rider, a man named Bill Hatcher, tumbled into the dirt and was immediately lost in the smog. "Retreat!" Coltrane screamed, wheeling his horse. "Fall back to the tree line!" But there was no retreat. As the men turned their horses, the smoke cleared momentarily, shifted by a gust of wind. And there, standing on the perimeter of the yard, were the warriors. They weren't just on the ridge. While the posse had been distracted by the fire and the smoke, Talzet had sent a ground unit to flank them. 5 warriors, painted in the colors of death, white clay and charcoal, stood blocking the road back to town. They didn't have bows. They had Winchester repeating rifles, likely stolen from the U.S. cavalry supply trains the previous month. Coltrane pulled his revolver. "Kill them! Kill them all!" He fired wildly. A warrior ducked with fluid grace, vanishing behind a scrub oak. The return fire was precise. Crack, crack, crack. 3 of Coltrane's deputies dropped from their saddles in unison. It was a display of marksmanship that froze the remaining men in terror. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an execution. Martha, still standing in the thinning smoke near her burning barn, watched in a trance. She saw Josiah Pete try to charge the line. A single shot rang out from the ridge. Pete flew backward off his horse, his shotgun spinning into the dust. The remaining men threw down their guns. They raised their hands, begging, crying out to God. "Don't shoot! We surrender!" Silas Cobb wailed on his knees. The firing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The only sound was the crackling of Martha's barn and the wheezing of a dying horse. From the ridge, a single rider descended. It was Talset. He rode slowly, his face devoid of anger, devoid of joy. It was the face of a judge delivering a verdict. He rode through the carnage, ignoring the whimpering men on the ground. He rode straight to where the smoke was clearing, revealing Martha Sterling. She stood there, soot-stained, her rifle in one hand, the other clutching her apron. She looked at Talset. He looked at her. He nodded, once, acknowledging that she had stood in the smoke. She had trusted him. Talset turned his horse toward Sheriff Coltrane. Coltrane had been thrown from his horse. He was scrambling backward in the dirt, trying to reach his fallen pistol. His hat was gone, revealing a bald head slick with sweat and ash. He looked up and saw the war chief towering over him. You can't do this," Coltrane stammered, his voice trembling. "I am a representative of the United States government. If you kill me, the army will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Talset didn't speak English this time. He looked at one of his warriors, a young man with a scar running down his cheek, and spoke a few words in Apache. The warrior dismounted and walked over to Coltrane. He kicked the pistol away. Then he grabbed Coltrane by the collar and dragged him toward the burning barn. "No, no, Martha!" Coltrane screamed, looking at her with wide, desperate eyes. "Martha, tell them I was just doing my job. Help me!" Martha stepped forward. Her heart pounded. She hated Coltrane. He was a tyrant, a thief, and a bully, but she was a Christian woman. Watching a man be thrown into a fire. Could she live with that? "Talset!" she called out. The chief stopped. He looked at her. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking. Talset tilted his head. He brought the fire. The fire is his. "If you burn him," Martha said, walking closer, ignoring the warriors who stiffened as she approached their chief, "you become him. You are a great chief. Be greater than this dog." The air crackled with tension. The Apache warriors looked at Martha as if she were insane. No one commanded Talset. Talset looked at Coltrane, who was sobbing in the dirt, wetting his trousers. Then he looked at the burning barn. "He is not worth the fire," Talset said finally. He signaled to his men. They dropped Coltrane. "But," Talset added, looking at the sheriff with eyes like flint, "he will not walk away." Talset drew a long, curved knife. He didn't attack Coltrane. Instead, he walked over to Coltrane's horse, a magnificent bay stallion with a U.S. Marshal brand. Talset cut the saddle cinch. He slapped the horse's flank, sending it galloping off toward the mountains. Then he turned to the other horses of the posse. One by one, the warriors cut them loose, driving them off. "You walk," Talset said to Coltrane and the survivors. "Red Rock is 20 miles. The wolves are hungry." He leaned down from his horse, looking Coltrane in the eye. "If I see you again, I will not listen to the woman." It was a fate almost worse than death. Stripped of their weapons, their horses, and their dignity, Coltrane and his men would have to walk through Apache territory, unarmed, back to town. They would arrive broken, humiliated men. Talset turned back to Martha. "The fire took your barn. My men will rebuild it." Martha shook her head. You don't have to. We will rebuild, he stated, leaving no room for argument. My daughters are safe. You are Inde. He used the Apache word for brother, or in this case, kin. Talzet raised a fist. The warriors mounted up. In seconds they melted back into the landscape, leaving Martha standing in the ashes of her barn, surrounded by the groaning wounded and a sheriff who looked as small as a child. Martha looked at Coltrane. He couldn't meet her eyes. He scrambled to his feet and began to limp down the road, his deputies following him like beaten dogs. Martha watched them go. She thought the worst was over. She thought the drama had ended with the fire. She was wrong, because the next day, a man in a black suit arrived from Tucson. He wasn't a sheriff. He wasn't a soldier. He was a lawyer for the mining consortiums, and he held a piece of paper that would threaten Martha more than any gun or arrow ever could. The battle for her life wasn't over. It had just changed battlefields. The silence that fell over the Sterling homestead after the raid was heavier than the gunfire. The physical war was over, but the psychological siege had just begun. For 3 weeks, Martha lived in a state of suspended animation. She slept with her Winchester across her chest. She woke at every creak of the floorboards, but the Apache did not return, and neither did Sheriff Coltrane. The town of Red Rock treated her as a pariah. When she rode into town for supplies, shopkeepers turned their backs. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering that she was a witch who summoned savages to do her bidding. She was no longer just a widow. She was the woman who had humiliated the law. But the true blow didn't come from a gun. It came in a carriage with velvet seats. On a Tuesday afternoon in early December, a black buggy rolled up her long, rutted driveway. It was driven by a man in a bowler hat, flanked by 2 armed Pinkerton guards. The passenger was a man named Phineas Thorne. Thorne was the lead counsel for the Arizona Copper and Mining Syndicate. He was a man who didn't sweat, even in the desert heat. He wore a suit that cost more than Martha's farm produced in 5 years. He didn't knock. He stood by the charred remains of the barn, which Martha had not yet been able to clear away, and waited for her to come out. Mrs. Sterling, Thorne said, removing his hat to reveal perfectly pomaded hair. A tragedy, truly. The sheriff tells me you had a domestic disturbance. Martha stood on the porch, wiping flour from her hands. State your business, Mr. Thorne. I have fences to mend. Thorne smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. I'm here to save you, Martha. May I call you Martha? The syndicate is aware of your situation. You have no husband. Your barn is ash. Your livestock is scattered. And rumor has it, you are under investigation for treason against the territory for harboring enemy combatants. Martha stiffened. I protected children. That's not treason. It's the Bible. The law acts on statutes, not scripture, Thorne replied smoothly. He pulled a document from his coat. The syndicate needs water. Your creek is the only reliable source in 10 miles. We are prepared to offer you $500 for the deed. It's a generous offer. Enough to move back east. Chicago, perhaps? Somewhere civilized. 500? Martha laughed bitterly. My husband died for this land. It's worth 10 times that. Thorne's smile vanished. That is the price for a clean title. But you don't have a clean title anymore, do you? You have a title stained by insurrection. If you refuse, I will file a motion with Judge Holloway to seize the property under the Territorial Safety Act. We will argue that you are mentally unfit and a danger to the community. You will be committed to an asylum, and we will take the land for free. He placed the paper on the fence post. You have until the winter solstice. That's 2 weeks. Sign it or lose it. He tipped his hat, climbed back into his carriage, and rode away. Martha was left trembling. She knew Judge Holloway. He was a drunkard who owed gambling debts to half the mining magnates in Tucson. A trial would be a sham. The next 2 weeks were a slow-motion nightmare. Martha tried to rally support. She went to the church, but the reverend wouldn't meet her eyes. She went to the bank to borrow money for a lawyer. But the banker, Mr. Henderson, suddenly claimed her credit was no good. The syndicate had strangled her. She was completely alone. She spent her nights reading law books she had kept from her father's library, trying to find a loophole. She found nothing. The Territorial Safety Act was vague and powerful. They could declare her insane simply for living alone. On December 20th, the day before the deadline, a blizzard struck the high desert, a rare white fury that buried the cactus and the sage. Martha sat by her fire, the unsigned deed on the table. She had run out of wood. She had run out of hope. She looked at the silver medallion Talzette had given her. It sat on the mantel, a cold reminder of the night she ruined her life to save 2 strangers. "Stand in the smoke," he had said. "There is no smoke left," she whispered to the empty room. "Only ice." The next morning, the deadline arrived. The sun glared off the snow, blinding and bright. At noon, Phineas Thorne returned. This time he brought the sheriff, not Coltrane, who had been fired in disgrace, but a new man, a temporary marshal named Silas Cobb, the very man who had tried to burn her barn. They brought a wagon to take her things. "Time's up, Martha," Thorne called out, his breath steaming in the air. "Did you sign?" Martha walked out onto the porch. She held the deed in one hand and a match in the other. "Get off my land," she said. Thorne sighed. "Marshal Cobb, execute the eviction order. She is trespassing on syndicate property." Cobb grinned. He had been waiting for this. He stepped onto the porch, his hand on his gun. "Don't make it hard, widow. We'll drag you out if we have to." Martha retreated into the doorway, grabbing her Winchester. It was a futile gesture. There were 6 Pinkertons behind the wagon. She could shoot 1, maybe 2. Then they would kill her. This is it, she thought. This is how it ends. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, but expecting a bullet. And then the ground began to shake. The match in Martha Sterling's hand flickered, a tiny defiant tongue of orange flame against the crushing white of the winter landscape. It was a pathetic weapon against the forces arrayed before her, but it was the only one she had left. Phineas Thorne sat in the velvet-lined carriage, a lap robe of fine wool tucked around his knees to ward off the biting December chill. He looked at the match, then at Martha, with an expression of bored pity. To him, she wasn't a person. She was an accounting error that needed to be corrected. Beside the carriage, Marshal Silas Cobb sat atop a nervous roan gelding, his hand resting casually on the pearl handle of his revolver. Behind them, 6 Pinkerton agents, men with dead eyes and expensive rifles, waited for the order to storm the porch. "Don't be melodramatic, Mrs. Sterling," Thorne called out, his voice thin and reedy in the freezing air. "Put out the match. There is no need for arson. The law has spoken. This property belongs to the Copper Syndicate. You are merely a guest who has overstayed her welcome." Martha didn't move. The cold seeped through the soles of her boots, turning her toes to ice, but her blood was boiling. "This land was bought with sweat and blood," she said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with rage. "You can take the dirt, Mr. Thorne, but you won't take the home. I'll burn it to the foundation before I let a snake like you sleep under my roof." Cobb chuckled, a wet, rasping sound. "Let her burn it, Mr. Thorne. Saves us the trouble of tearing it down. We only want the water rights anyway." He nudged his horse forward, the animals' hooves crunching loudly on the crusted snow. But first, we got to remove the trespasser. "Boys." Two of the Pinkertons dismounted. They moved with the casual arrogance of men who knew they were untouchable. They unholstered their batons, clearly intending to drag the widow off the porch by force. Martha raised the match higher. She looked at the pile of dry kindling she had stacked by the doorframe, soaked in the last of her kerosene. "One more step," she warned. The world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down. The silence of the high desert was absolute, save for the heavy breathing of the men and the creak of the carriage springs. And then, the coffee in the tin cup resting on the carriage step rippled. It was a small thing at first, concentric circles appearing in the dark liquid. Thorne frowned, adjusting his spectacles. "What in the blazes?" Then came the sound. It wasn't a noise so much as a pressure in the ears, a low, bass-heavy vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It sounded like a freight train moving through a tunnel deep underground. Cobb's horse pinned its ears back and danced sideways, tossing its head. "Steady," Cobb grunted, fighting the reins. He looked toward the north, toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. "Earthquake?" "In December?" Thorne snapped. "Impossible." The vibration grew. It escalated from a hum to a roar, a rhythmic, thundering cadence that rattled the window panes in the cabin behind Martha. Snow began to shake loose from the pine trees lining the drive. Martha lowered the match. She knew that sound. It was the sound of the summer storms that rolled through the canyons, echoing off the canyon walls. But the sky was clear. "Look!" one of the Pinkertons shouted, pointing a gloved finger toward the ridgeline. At first, it looked like a brown fog rolling over the crest of the hill, a cloud of dust and snow, kicked up into a chaotic swirl. But as it crested the rise, the fog took shape. Heads, manes, flaring nostrils. It was a wall of muscle. "Stampede!" Cobb screamed, his voice cracking. "Stampede! Get the wagon turned around!" But it was too late. The herd poured over the ridge like a dam breaking. They were wild mustangs, hundreds of them. Bays, sorrels, paints, roans. Their coats were thick with winter fur, their breath blasting from their lungs in plumes of white steam. They didn't run with the blind panic of a stampede. They ran with fluid, terrifying purpose. They hit the valley floor and fanned out, creating a pincer movement that would have made a cavalry general jealous. The ground shook so violently that Phineas Thorne was thrown against the side of his carriage. The Pinkertons' horses, trained animals used to gunfire and crowds, lost their minds. They reared and bucked, throwing two agents into the snow. The mustangs didn't trample the men. They encircled them. It was a display of chaotic control. The wild horses swirled around the house, the carriage and the lawman, creating a living, moving barricade of horseflesh. They galloped in a tight cyclone, cutting off any escape route. The noise was deafening, the thunder of thousands of hooves on frozen earth, the squeals of dominance, the snorts of exertion. Martha stood pressed against her front door, watching with wide eyes. The heat of the animals rose into the air, creating a sudden, localized fog that obscured the sun. Through the swirling dust and steam, riders appeared. They didn't ride with saddles or reins. They guided their mounts with knee pressure and whispers. They were dressed not in feathers and war paint, but in heavy buffalo robes and buckskin coats to weather the winter. They carried rifles, but they didn't aim them. They held them across their laps, easy and relaxed. The Pinkertons were paralyzed. They were city-hired guns, used to intimidations and labor strikes. They had never seen an Apache war party, let alone one controlling a herd of this magnitude. The cyclone of horses began to slow, settling into a restless, shifting wall that blocked the syndicate men from the road, from the canyon, and from the world. One rider broke from the circle. He rode a massive black and white paint horse that moved with the heavy grace of a predator. The rider was older than the others. His hair was streaked with grey, his face lined like a dried riverbed. He wore a heavy wool coat, likely traded or taken from a trapper. But beneath it, the turquoise amulet at his throat was unmistakable. It was Talzet. He rode slowly toward the porch, ignoring the Pinkertons as if they were fence posts. He stopped his horse 10 feet from where Martha stood. The animal huffed, blowing warm air toward her. Talzet looked at the match in her hand, which had long since gone out. He looked at the kerosene-soaked wood. Then he looked at her face. "You light fires when it is cold," Talzet said. His voice was deep, carrying easily over the shifting herd. "But this is not a fire for warmth." Martha dropped the burnt matchstick into the snow. Her legs felt weak, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. "They came for the land," Tal said. "They have a paper. They say I have a debt." Talzet turned his head slowly to look at the carriage. Phineas Thorne was cowering in the corner of his seat, clutching his briefcase to his chest. Marshal Cobb was struggling to keep his horse from bolting, his face a mask of pale terror. "A paper," Talzet repeated. The word sounded ridiculous in his mouth, like a joke. He nudged his horse toward the carriage. The Pinkertons leveled their rifles, their hands shaking. "Don't!" Cobb shouted to his men. "Don't fire. You'll start a massacre." Talzet didn't even flinch. He rode until his leg brushed the wheel of the carriage. He looked down at Thorne. "You are the paper man?" Talzet asked. Thorne swallowed hard, adjusting his bowler hat which had gone askew. I am the legal representative of the Arizona Copper Syndicate. And you are obstructing a federal eviction. I suggest you move your livestock before the U.S. Army is notified." It was a bluff, and everyone knew it. The Army was 3 days' ride away at Fort Bowie. Talzet smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It didn't reach his eyes. The Army does not ride in the snow, and the paperman does not ride at all. Talzet gestured to the herd behind him. The sea of horses shifted, restless and powerful. "The widow says she has a debt. She says you want the land because she has no metal to give you. It's a matter of back taxes and outstanding liens," Thorne stammered, trying to regain his composure. $500, a sum she does not possess. Therefore, the title reverts to the syndicate. $500, Talzet said. He tested the words. He reached behind him, to a heavy saddlebag made of rawhide. It looked old and stained. He undid the leather ties with deliberate slowness. "The white man loves the yellow metal," Talzet said, more to himself than to Thorne. "You dig holes in the mountain. You poison the water. You kill the trees. All for the yellow metal." He pulled the bag free. It was heavy. The muscles in Talzet's forearm corded as he hefted it. "My fathers knew of the metal," Talzet continued. "We do not use it for trade. We use it for bullets. We use it for beauty. But we know where it sleeps in the earth." He swung the bag. It flew through the air and landed with a sickeningly heavy thud on the floorboards of the carriage, right between Thorne's polished boots. The leather burst open at the seam. It wasn't dust. It wasn't coin. It was raw, placer gold. Nuggets the size of walnuts, jagged and dull shining in the winter light. It spilled out over Thorne's shoes, a fortune in raw mineral. Thorne stared at it. His mouth hung open. Cobb's eyes bugged out of his head. Even the Pinkertons lowered their rifles, hypnotized by the sight. That is... Thorne couldn't finish the sentence. "Gold," Talzet said flatly. "From the deep canyons where the white man is afraid to go. There is 500 there. Maybe 5,000. I do not count." Martha stepped off the porch. She walked past the Pinkertons, who parted for her like the Red Sea. She walked up to Talzet's horse. "Talzet," she whispered. "You can't. That's a king's ransom. Why?" Talzet looked down at her. For the first time, his face softened. The mask of the war chief slipped, revealing the father underneath. "You gave my daughter's life," he said quietly. "You stood in the smoke. You did not sell them to the blue coats. A life is worth more than metal. A life is worth more than land." He pointed a gloved hand at Thorn. "The debt is paid. The land is hers. Forever." Thorn was scrambling now, greedy hands scooping the nuggets into his pockets, into his briefcase, stuffing them wherever they would fit. He looked like a starving man at a banquet. Yes, of course," Thorn babbled. "Acceptable. Highly acceptable. We can consider the lien satisfied. Marshal, make a note of it." Cobb looked at the gold, then at the 300 Apache warriors and the hundreds of wild horses surrounding them. He realized that if they didn't leave now, they would never leave. The gold was a gift, but it was also a warning. Take it and go, or stay and die. "We're done here," Cobb growled, holstering his gun. "Let's move out." "Wait," Talzet commanded. The command cracked like a whip. Thorn froze, a nugget halfway to his pocket. Talzet leaned in close to the lawyer. "The paper." Thorn blinked. I beg your pardon." "The paper," Talzet repeated, pointing to the eviction notice Thorn had been waving earlier. "Leave the paper. Take the metal." Thorn fumbled in his coat pocket. He pulled out the deed, the document that would have stolen Martha's life. He held it out with a trembling hand. Talzet snatched it. He didn't look at it. He handed it down to Martha. "Burn it," Talzet said to her. Martha took the document. She looked at the signature, the legal seals, the stamps of the territory. It was just paper. Fragile, flammable paper. She walked back to the porch. She picked up her box of matches. She struck one. She held the flame to the corner of the deed. The paper curled, blackened, and then caught fire. She held it until the heat singed her fingertips, then dropped the burning ash into the snow. She looked up at the lawyer and the marshal. "Get off my land." Thorn didn't need to be told twice. "Driver, go! Now!" The carriage driver whipped the horses. The carriage lurched forward, skidding on the ice. The Pinkertons scrambled into their saddles, desperate to escape the circle of silent warriors. Talzet whistled. The wall of mustangs parted, creating a narrow gauntlet for the syndicate men to flee through. As the carriage rattled away, slipping and sliding down the driveway, the warriors let out a collective cry. Not a war cry, but a sound of mocking laughter that echoed off the canyon walls. Martha stood in the driveway, watching them disappear. The silence returned to the valley, but it wasn't the lonely silence of before. It was filled with the soft sounds of the horses. She turned to Talzet. He was still watching the road, ensuring the enemy was truly gone. "You brought the gold," Martha said, wiping a tear she hadn't realized was falling. "But the horses, there are hundreds." Talzet looked at the herd. The animals were calming down now, grazing on the dry grass poking through the snow. "The winter is hard," Talzet said. "The grazing in the high country is gone. The snow is too deep for the foals." He looked at Martha. "These horses need a valley. They need water. And they need a keeper who does not break their spirit." He gestured to the entire herd. "They are yours. Trade them. Sell them. Keep them. They are the blood of the land. Now, they run with you." Martha was stunned. He hadn't just paid her mortgage. He had given her a livelihood. He had given her an empire. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. I'm just one woman." "You are not just a woman," Talzet corrected her. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "You are the mother of the smoke." and you are in day." He signaled to his men. The warriors turned their mounts. They didn't say goodbye. In the Apache way, there was no goodbye, only the next path. Talzet paused one last time. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Not gold this time. He tossed it gently to her. Martha caught it. Inside was a collection of dried herbs, sage, cedar, and sweetgrass. Medicine for the spirit. "When the wind howls," Talzet said, his eyes crinkling at the corners, "burn this. It keeps the ghosts away." With a sharp yip, he kicked his heels into the paint horse's flanks. The horse reared, pivoting on its hind legs, and bolted toward the tree line. The warriors followed, a stream of shadows moving against the white snow. Martha stood alone in the center of her yard. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were 300 wild mustangs, the steam from their bodies warming the air, their soft knickers filling the silence. She looked down at the pile of ash that used to be the eviction notice. Then she looked at the mountains where Talzet had vanished. She walked over to the nearest horse, a young sorrel mare with a white star on her forehead. The horse flinched as she approached, eyes wide with wild fear. Martha didn't rush. She extended a hand, palm up, just as she had done for the terrified girls in her kitchen a month ago. "Easy now," Martha whispered, her voice steady and kind. "You're safe here. We're both safe now." The mare hesitated, sniffed the air, and then, slowly, stretched out her neck to touch her velvet nose to Martha's palm. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the valley in brilliant, blinding gold. Martha Sterling took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. The paper war was over. The real work was just beginning. And that, my friends, is the incredible, untold legend of Martha Sterling. A woman who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the Wild West wasn't a Winchester. It was kindness. Now I have to ask you, what would you have done? If you were Martha, alone in that cabin, hearing that knock at the door, would you have opened it? Or would you have kept it locked? It's a choice that defines a legacy. Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story gave you chills, if you felt the heat of that fire and the thunder of those hooves, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. It helps us find more lost stories from the frontier to bring to you. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have a saga coming up next week about a gold prospector who found a fortune but lost his mind. You do not want to miss it. Thanks for riding with us today. Keep your powder dry, and I'll see you in the next one.